Hello, friends. It's Chop.
In terms of pressure, this has been a pressure point on the Iranian government before. There were protests over the hijab back in 2017 and 2018 that followed similar ideological lines as this. Back in 2009, this was already an issue. The main reformist candidate, Mir Hossein Mousavi, made that a cornerstone of his campaign, getting rid of the morality police's ability to enforce. I can't even remember if he wanted to get rid of it entirely. Um, as far back as the reformist movement has been in existence since the late 90s, this has been a pressure point. But even though there have been moves in that direction by people in parliament, in the cabinet, even in the presidency at times, it has not moved at all. There is a belief among the Iranian government, by people in the Iranian government, that if this very visible aspect of Islamic governance is rolled back, that there may be a domino effect of other visible aspects being repealed, and that it may lead to other such things in the future.
Speaking of people in and out of the Iranian government, I saw just the other day that former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad came out and said against the requirement of wearing a hijab in public. Is this sort of like a face turn for him? Because I remember him being sort of a voice of social conservatism when he was in government.
No, Ahmadinejad has made quite the face turn since he was president. He has attempted to rebrand himself as a self-proclaimed liberal Democrat since his presidency. Now, that is not to say that he was always strictly within the conservative establishment. He was always butting heads with them, and he always had certain more liberal viewpoints than they did. But it has absolutely been a massive turnaround in terms of ideology. As an example of that, not just with the hijab and other things like that, recently he came out very much in favor of Ukraine against Russia. He had made, and also within that position, supporting Taiwan. I think he was convinced that there was supposed to be a US, Russia, China plot to invade Taiwan, Ukraine, and Iran all at the same time. He has found a way to incorporate his own peculiarities into a liberal framework.
Well, I mean, he's on Twitter now. He's back on Twitter, so
Oh, sure,
he
sure.
must
He's
be.
on Twitter.
Yeah.
He's back in Michigan football. He's I don't know. He's living his own life.
You pointed out an interesting incident the other day where, among the protesters, they set fire to the statue of an Iranian revolutionary intellectual. Could you give us some of the background for that, or why that's noteworthy or interesting?
What has been, I think, interesting about this in particular, it's not unprecedented for protesters to call for the end for the Islamic Republic, for the death of Khamenei, for death to so-called dictators. What has been interesting and unprecedented, I think, is the level of disdain directed toward government ideological figures, to government municipality, like local government municipalities have been overrun. There was a brief time in which a town called Oshnavie in the country's east was completely overrun by protesters. There has been, I think this is probably the most severe instance of a kind of outpouring of anti-Islamist fervor. The generation that seems to be leading these kinds of protests are the youngest generation, the Zoomers, Gen Z. And my friend Sina Tusi made the point that Gen Z in Iran is not used to the idea of projecting a public, religiously complacent face that other generations were used to. The face that they project to the internet and the face that they project in public to them needs to be unified. And the idea of granting any sort of respect to figures of the Islamic Republic's past, which they were not around for, is going to seem alien. It's going to not make a whole lot of sense.
And like, yeah, like, and is the younger generation's attitude toward the hijab? I mean, we would have to be different from the older generations because I mean, you talked about how first the Shah outlawed the hijab, and then it became a symbol of freedom and independence. And I suppose the younger generation feels just the opposite. It's that it's a symbol of oppression and surveillance.
I haven't been able to see an age breakdown of that, of the polling on that issue significantly, but there are age breakdowns on support for Raisi as president, the current conservative president, and who has, of course, championed the crackdown on the protesters, very conservative ideals, very religiously conservative ideals. He's not a neoconservative in the Iranian context like Ahmadinejad was. And obviously, as you get older, support for him pretty substantially increases. There is a very significant divide between those who grew up, or at least were alive for, the Shah's time, when wearing the hijab was a symbol of, opposition to the establishment, to the government, and between people who grew up after the Islamic Republic, who know no other system, and who's know that not wearing the hijab is the anti-establishment, the anti-government position.
Like, and how would you say that these protests? I mean, you mentioned that the inciting incident was a Kurdish woman visiting Tehran. How do these protests sort of complicate the kind of tenuous notion of like an Iranian national identity? Because like Kurds are about what, a population of about 9 or 10 million within Iran. Is it breaking down on these kind of like ethnic sectarian lines? And like, how does that like yeah, how does that play into like how like young people like see themselves as Iranians?
I think I have now. What is interesting about these protests is that a lot of people were waiting, a lot of analysts were waiting for this moment in which working class Iranians from ethnic minority groups and middle class Iranians from places like Tehran would protest roughly at the same time. Because in previous protest movements, they had mostly protested separately, as separate groups. These protests have been cross sectarian, cross ethnic, cross class for the most part. Um, However, the objectives of these protests, at least in the eyes of different groups, do divert based on location, based on place. The Iranian government, in particular, has seized on the fears some people have of Kurdish separatism. They have been really honing in on the threats posed by Kurdish armed organizations in Iran, who are operating outside of Iran but are have obviously directed their guns toward Iran, and are hoping for that kind of narrative change. Just the other day, there was a ballistic missile attack on the headquarters of Komala, which is a Kurdish center left group that is based in Iraqi Kurdistan. The IRGC fired ballistic missiles at them. The In terms of the actual population of Iran, realigning that discussion around if Iran can truly be a multi-ethnic state. Personally, I haven't seen that quite yet. If the protests continue and they don't abate, I could maybe see that happening, but at the moment, I haven't seen it.
And like, how, like, what are the aims and objectives of these protests? I mean, it started out like a simple matter of we don't want to be compelled to wear the hijab under threat of imprisonment or harassment by police forces. But have the objectives sort of evolved as these protests have gone on to something broader about Iranian government and society?
I think almost immediately they became about the Iranian government and the Islamic Republic as a system. Initially, they were chants about, optional hijab, and that was pretty much it. But very quickly, it became chants against the system itself, talking about killing people, the people who killed Mahsa Amini. It has definitely become a larger thing. And additionally, not just talking about the current government system, but also rejecting different government systems. Many of the chants that were heard in Tehran were against both the Shah and the Islamic Republic. It has, I think, in many ways become a protest with the goal of overthrowing the Islamic Republic, but to what extent that is the common opinion of the Iranian people, I'm not sure. There's no real data to that effect. And President Raisi, just a year ago, had an approval rating of 70% among the Iranian public. It's much lower now, but it used to be 70%. And typically, the beliefs among people of toward overthrowing their entire governmental system as a whole does not sway so wildly within a year's time. So it's a bit difficult to say.
Um, what does the U.S. response to these protests look like at present, and what will it look like in the future in light of the Biden administration's larger Iran policy? Because I mean, they still are, I guess, technically trying to do this nuclear deal, and then also since these protests have like announced another round of sanctions on Iranian oil exports.
The U.S. government has moved almost immediately to obviously exploit the protests and grant them, their support, their verbal support at the very least. Now they have not gone probably as far as the Trump administration would have gone. Obviously, if Trump were in power, Pompeo, Pence himself would likely be at the forefront of this kind of narrative, trying to spread any which thing. In 2019, they did similar things. They published casualty reports, which were way out of line with what journalists studying Iran were thinking. They were actively trying to muddy the waters with intelligence from the MEK and things like that. So far, the Biden administration has not tried to do that, at least not yet. As you said, the negotiations over the nuclear deal complicate these things. Obviously, the animus of the American government is to interfere. It is to influence. It is to try to make way for a administration that might be popular, might be both not necessarily popular in Iran, but would be popular with the American government that would be friendly to them. But they are also trying to get the Iran deal done, and that requires a bit more carefulness and a bit more tact. The issue is that these negotiations have been stuck in purgatory for God knows how long now, and I'm not sure that they are going to go anywhere in the near future. And I'm not sure if any response from the Biden administration to the protests would change that. I think it's going to stay. The sanctions that are currently existing on Iran, I think, are going to remain there for the near future, especially because the election's coming up, and especially if you're trying to court Republican voters, getting an Iran deal done that they're going to seize on is not going to be very beneficial to them.
If I could just get your reaction to some advice for the Biden administration. This comes courtesy of Bobby Gosh, of the Washington Post. Quote, Biden should amplify the voices of Iran's protesters. He writes, the challenge for Biden is to help the protesters without allowing the regime to portray them as American stooges. The most useful thing the U.S. can do is amplify the voices of the protesters and help them evade the regime's blackouts to better communicate with each other and coordinate their protests. One practical way to achieve this is to exempt from international sanctions Elon Musk's Starlight satellite system, which can provide internet connectivity to Iranians. The U.S. Treasury has said some satellite internet equipment can be exported to Iran. At the diplomatic level, the State Department should also use every opportunity to draw attention to the protests and encourage American allies to do likewise. Every statement relating to the negotiations over the revival of the Iran nuclear deal should be accompanied with a strong reiteration of solidarity with the protesters and an equally forceful denunciation of the crackdown. So, I mean, yeah, like, what do you think we could do more to amplify these voices, or should we? Because from what because it may the more we amplify, the more they may seem like stooges. The more we may
I,
all seem like stooges.
I love Bobby. He's a great guy. He's a great mind, genius, seeping out of that man's ears like pus. The issue that I think a lot of Iran analysts have brought up before, people who are Iranian themselves, is that a lot of failures of protest movements in Iran have been connected to the fact that U.S. sanctions it has resulted in the filtering of a lot of social networks, a lot of ways for Iranians to communicate. So the fact that those sanctions still exist is an active impediment. It's not simply the fact that the sanctions on certain internet systems exist. And I saw that there was a thread about this Starlink system that Elon Musk wants to put up there, and apparently it's very easy to like track down the places where it's transmitting from. So I imagine it's a huge security flaw. But no, I mean, there is no way for the Biden administration to do both of those things at once, even if it wanted to somehow do that honestly. Once you give them that kind of PR, once you publicly back them, you are feeding evidence into the Islamic Republic's data banks that these protests are Western backed, that they're CIA operations, because they can see it on the Twitter pages of Israel's Twitter account, in their Persian language communications, on the pages of the State Department website. Even if they did not themselves instigate the protests, you are giving them all the fodder in the world to make that accusation. It helps nobody. It I mean, Bobby is he I mean, I don't think he's being honest, but obviously he is assuming too much honesty on the part of people like Tony Blinken or Joe Biden.
So you say it's like a don't change your Twitter avi to just a blank green circle just yet.
No, no, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, speaking of PR and CIA operations, Seamus, are you familiar with this woman I'm seeing on TV all the time who's like a voice of like the Iranian protest movement? She's in Brooklyn. I forget her name at the moment, but I saw her on Jake Tapper the other day. I'm just wondering, well, what's your read on this lady as like the voice of all Iranian women?
um, Masih Ali Najad, I believe is the woman that you were speaking of.
Yes, that's it. That's the one.
She, just for some brief context for people who may have probably seen her face around but don't quite know who she is, Masih used to be a reporter for reformist newspapers in Iran. After a while, she left and she became an anti-hijab activist, and she eventually became a media personality working for the Voice of America. She is paid by Voice of America. This is not conjecture. This is not saying someone is CIA for the sake of saying they're CIA. There are investigations to this effect that she is paid thousands of dollars by the State Department. Nevertheless, because of the amount of attention that she receives for her activism, she has positioned herself as the I don't well she has positioned herself as a very influential figure. She disagrees with the assessment that she is the leader, but she is making all kinds of she's implying it very, very, very heavily to anyone who will listen, like Dexter Filkins, who wrote a New Yorker profile about her. Despite these assertions, I now I have not seen every video that comes out of Iran, so I cannot say this for sure. But I have never seen any protester mention Messi's name. I have never heard any chant. I have never seen any evidence that this woman is any kind of leader position of anything or any source of influence. This is a recurring problem because back in 2017, 2018, when there were other anti-hijab protests and Messi was again positioning herself as a leader in this kind of movement, female figures in Iran, celebrities who were involved in the protests, had to come out and say, no, no one is being influenced by Messi here. She's not a leader and she should stop saying that. But nevertheless, she continues to do so. And her connections with Voice of America, her connections with the government endanger people when she constantly feels the need to make these connections with her and these movements.
Did I see that she changed her name at some point?
I'm not entirely sure. Can you give me information about this?
Actually, I can't. Someone told me yesterday she changed her name to mean Messiah.
Now, yes, Messi is. Yes, that is the name. That is the name of Messiah. Yeah, her first name. You know, there might be something. Her first name was Masume beforehand. I don't know the exact reasons for why she did so, but God, there may be something to that. God, I hope not. That's so
Well,
weird.
if you're going to be the messiah for all women in Iran, it'd be good to change. You could be good to have a name that speaks to that. Um, I guess okay. My last question here is the role of the current Ayatollah. I have read speculation that he is quite ill at the moment and may be knocking on heaven's door. Could you speak about the current Ayatollah, the state of his health, and what this means in general for these protests and the state of Iran in going forward in the future?
Khamenei, the current supreme leader, he's 83 years old. He has had pretty significant health problems in the past. There was a report in the New York Times that said I believe he had major surgery, but that turned out not to be completely accurate. But, you know, you have to remember this man had an assassination attempt on him that partially paralyzed him. He's had problems for years. Uh, Even if he was solely 83, he'd be in danger of dying. So the question of his succession, who will come after him, even if it is taboo to talk about in Iran in polite circles, it is very much on everyone's mind. Um, the current most likely candidate that people are talking about is the current president, Ebrahim Raisi. Now, this is following in the trend that had been established when Khomeini died. Khomeini at the time was the president, and they decided because for certain multiple reasons, one of which was that he was known to the people, he was anointed as the successor. Now, the issue is that Raisi, while he is known to the people as he is the president of Iran, he is not nearly as popular as Khamenei was when he was president. Raisi's approval rating is currently in the high 20s. It's about 10% lower than Joe Biden's lowest approval rating. In order to get him elected, the Guardian Council of Iran had to disqualify many different candidates, and it resulted in the lowest turnout in Iranian presidential history. So, while I don't think that I don't believe the speculation that it's going to cause an earth-shattering fall of the Islamic Republic, it is going to definitely be a point of concern if they decide to push him as successor, because he does not have the same criteria as Khamenei did, which has allowed him to continue being supreme leader fairly undaunted. In terms of the state of the protests now and what there will probably be going forward, the fears that I had that there was going to be a crackdown like 2019, a swift one, have not panned out. What they appear to be doing is a partial filtration of the internet while still pretty harshly cracking down on the protesters. But my current prediction is that they will likely continue for a little bit longer, but like with many movements in the past, they will likely burn themselves out. Even if there are strikes currently happening among students and among professors, if there is no change that is going to happen in the government itself, and the government is committed still to continuously mobilizing its supporters and mobilizing the police,